back again, and welcome back to the continuation of this rebooted application that we're working on. From the last video, we're just going to crack straight on into building our first controller, which is going to be our home controller. So I'm just going to get straight into it. And as I said in the last video, I did explain, or I tried to explain the Bootstrap index file, what that does, what we're loading. So quickly look at that file again. We've got our index file, which is the main entry point into our application, where we got a lot of constants. Well, we've got 5 constants that we've defined. We're loading our composer that's going to auto load our components for us, and we're pretty much setting up our application by passing the relevant configurations from our YAML files to these various methods within our base application class. Right, so that's essentially what this is doing. It's providing a gateway into the application so we can actually start doing something. So as I said, I've got my environment now set up. I've changed a couple of settings in my Apache config file. So I've set my environment up. I'm hoping that you guys have already got an environment set up so you can follow along. At some point we're going to try and switch to Docker using Nginx and PHP FPM, but at some point, not right now. But we're going to stick to old XAMPP local environment so we can actually start quickly build stuff on. Right, so we got our index file. This is our main entry point, and it's located within the public directory. That's where the HC access file is looking for this file in our public directory. So we got our file. What exactly is it that are we going to start building this application? By default, so we've got this app directory, and essentially all of our application files and classes is going to be located within this app directory. And the reason why that is because in our composer JSON file, we've got this PSR4 auto loading, which is pointed to the app directory. So whatever file we create or directory that we've put in this app folder, that's going to be our application that's going to load to our front end or to our client. Right, so that's essentially what this is. It's pretty simple to start building an application from it. There isn't any sort of like silly configurations. But it's as simple as starting to create files within app directory. And the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a new folder within our app directory called Composer. So I'm going to create that. It's going to call, not Composer, controllers I should say, singular controller. They're going to be controller. So now that we've got our controller directory, we're going to be creating all of our front-end client-side controller files within this controller directory. And if when we're going to be doing our admin stuff, we're going to be creating a subdirectory within this controller directory. I'm going to put in our admin files within that admin directory. Right, so I'm going to load up the front end so you can see what we're going to be seeing at this point when you just start your application, what you can expect to see. So let me get my screen ready. So at the minute I'm going to type in localhost because my environment is up and running, and let's basically see what is going to be coming up, because this is good for me as much as it is for you, because I've not sort of like sat down and gone through it from this point of view. So we're going to be seeing all the errors or potential errors we're going to be getting, and we're going to be working through it together, because it's going to help me as much as it's going to help you, so I can see where I need to sort of like modify the code as we go along. Right, so we're sort of like doing this together. So I'm going to type in localhost, and that's the first message that we're getting. So route does not match any valid route. So essentially we haven't got anything set up, so it doesn't know what to point to. So there's nothing valid about localhost because we have got nothing set up. So first thing first, what we want to do when we're sort of like building any application, we want to sort of like define our routes. right? And how we do that is within the config directory. We're going to go down to our routes. Let me switch my screen again, sorry. So we're going to go to our routes, and within this route, that YAML file is where we're going to be defining all of our routes, right? And unlike other frameworks where we sort of like do the get method and pass in the verb, the request method, stuff like that, we're not. That's not how this is done. This is done a little bit differently. This is essentially defining an array, right? So I'm going to uncomment these, and let me explain to you what this is. So the empty quotes is defining our own page. Own page will mean no quotes, because it's going to type in localhost or www.example.com, and it's going to load the front page. This is what this empty quote define. And within the empty quote, which is like the key of the array, we're sort of like defining another array within that main array, and we've got a key value pair. So controller key is defined so the value of controller is going to be ohm, right? And we're not going to suffix it with controller because we're already going to be doing that within, or we're already doing that within the core framework. We're already suffixing it with the controller suffix, right? And we're already formatting it as well, so you get that nice camel case as we normally use for our controller classes. So we got a controller which defines the main controller class. We got action which defines the index, and also in our controller classes, when we define our methods as index, we have to suffix it with also the action string. So it's going to be index action, but in our YAML files, we only define the name of the route, which is going to be index, right? The action suffix bit is something that is being done internally. So if we're going to be referencing this route, we don't need to reference it with the action suffix. We're just going to be referencing it with what we've defined it as in our YAML file, right? The action suffix is a way that I'm actually using the methods to do some other stuff internally, but externally we're going to be referencing the method as how we defined it within the YAML file. So there's also a couple of other prefixes, keys that we can define on individual routes, but for our main home controller route, these are the only two keys we're going to be defining for now. Other keys include a ID and namespace, right? We could pretty much add whatever key we want in the core class, but that's not what we're going to be doing right now. I'm just going to leave it as it is. For the time being, our controller route requires only, well, our YAML file only needs to know the controller and the method that we're going to be pointing to by default. So this is how we define our first route within this framework. And I'm going to take it back to my front end page, going to reload it. I'm going to see what pops up. So if I reload this page, now we're getting our next error. Well, it's not an error as per se. It's basically saying we've defined a home controller, or we define a home route, but it cannot find a home controller. So that's the first controller that we're going to create, and we're going to add that index action method in, and then we can define our front page from that. So I'm going to go to my editor again. Then we're going to go to controller. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to create it as home controller. And note that when you're creating your controller files, it has to be in a camel case, like capital H and a capital C for your controller. Just like what I've got right here, home controller. Now that's open. Now what I want to be doing right now is I want to talk you through all the steps that is required for each controller, because once you understand the steps and follow all the convention, then creating any controller is going to be exactly the same, right? Now, I always start with the declaration because this is a strictly type framework. So we have to declare the strict type at the very top of the page. So declare strict, and we're going to create a namespace, and I'm in the app directory, and I'm now within the controller directory. And this is pretty much how we define the namespace for this particular class. I'm going to say class, say home controller. Just like so. Right? So that's pretty much pretty basic stuff, right, so far. So within each controller classes, and it could be any controller classes, we have to extend that base controller class. So we're going to say extend base controller, just like so, and it bring that in for us automatically. And that base controller is stored as part of our core framework. So what the base controller class does, what it sort of like gives is an extension of or extendable functionality. So we can create a lot of methods and functions that we can reuse in any controller class. So we extend into the base controller, and that gives us a lot more functions that we can actually use within any of our controller class. So all of our controller class must also define a public constructor. Say public function construct, and I'm using PHP Storm, and it's automatically auto-completing my code for me. But I'm going to explain to you what exactly just happened. So we've created a constructor, and in the constructor it placed this array argument, this route params. Now in our route controller, when we create these controller classes, when the request comes in, we create a controller class and dispatch that controller, which handles the request and does all the view and sort of like getting the data from the model if that's what the request is requesting. So when we build those controller classes, we also passed in the route parameters within the constructor. Hence the reason why we've got that route params in our main constructor class, right? And we're simply going to call the parent construct, which is our base controller, and we're going to pass that parameter within the base controller constructor. That then gives the base controller all the parameters of the current route, so we can sort of like build out smaller functions that's going to help us do certain stuff. Now, I mentioned that in our route files, in our route.yaml file, we got some key value. Like we got like controllers, we got index, not index, we got action, and I said we could add some more like ID and namespace. Now, those parameters is what we got within this route parameter. Now, when we pass it down to the parents constructor, we can then create small functions like get route ID or get this controller route or get this controller namespace, and it's going to return a string value of the current route, current ID if there is one present within the URL, and it can also return the current namespace. So that's pretty much what that is, right? So also in the constructor, I've also developed what I'm calling local dependency injection. So what the local dependency injection does, it allows us to pass in local dependencies that the current controller is going to be depending on, and it's only going to be auto-loading those within the specific controller, and it's going to auto-wire any other dependencies that is required by the dependencies that we're defining within our constructor. And all we do that within a method called add two methods actually, one called di controller. If you've seen that in previous iteration, I've now renamed it to add definition. The DI container still works. I've just created another method called add definition, which simply returns that DI container method. So I'm going to say this add definition, right? And this definition takes in an array of key value pairs, where the key becomes the property of the class and the value is the object, right? So even though we haven't got any dependencies for this controller just yet, I'm going to do a quick example of what that looks like. So I'm going to just create an example file, or create an example array with no actual files, just so you can see the structure of what that looks like. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say example model, for example. I'm going to assign that to, so for instance, we've got a model directory within our app directory. I'm going to say model or example model colon class, right? And that could effectively be a model within our app directory called example model, right? And we're simply going to declare it at the top like so. So I'm going to say use app, and it's going to be model example model. Now that is how we would reference that class within our add definition. So we'll reference the class at the top using that use statement. I will simply taking the end of it, putting it down in our assignment and colon class. That's going to get the fully qualified namespace of that example model. So this is how we define local dependency, and we can define, should put 2s right here. This is how we define our local dependency, and we could have as much as we want or as little as we want. We're simply adding the dependencies that our specific class requires. There are going to be instances, well, there will be instances where we sort of like need dependencies across all of our controller. Now, that's what I showed you within that provider. If I bring that back up again, the config providers. Now, these are all dependencies that is injected into all the controllers by default. So by default, no matter what controller that we're in, we have got access to all of these objects that we could reference. So in my home controller, I'm going to get rid of this actually, because I'm not using that. I'm going to leave the method there, but I'm going to define the index action method, and I'm going to dump out one of those objects from the container so you can see what I'm saying. So I'm going to say, and also note as well, as I'm touching onto this one, all the methods, all our route action methods within our controller has to be declared as a protected method. And there's a reason why I'm declaring it as a protected method, because later on, as you will learn as we're going through the framework, the protected methods, the importance of that is that I'm using PHP reflection to do. As a matter of fact, I'm doing quite a lot of different stuff with these methods, and declaring them as protected means that I can use PHP reflection class to specifically target these protected methods, so I can do different stuff along the way. So all your route methods must be declared as protected methods. If you've got other methods within your controller class, you can declare them as either public or private, but your route methods must be declared as a protected method. So I'm going to say protected function, say index action, right? And we're using the, I think we call it studded caps syntax for our method name. So we start with a lowercase, and then each word is separated by a capital letter. That's important as well, right? So we got our index action route. I'm going to visit that route on my screen. I'm going to change my screen again so you can see what that looks like. So I'm going to reload my browser and see. Let's see what happens. So reload. And this is good because this is what I'm saying. It's, you know, this is going to help me as much as it's going to help you, because we're building this fresh from scratch. We're going to come across these little errors that I might have forgotten to take out, but I know what these errors are. Essentially, what it's saying, app model controller settings, is obviously a file that we've not yet created, so it doesn't know. It's throwing this error because the file does not exist, and that is something that is defined within my providers. Let me turn my screen again. That is something that is defined within the providers, so that's the reason why we're getting that error, and it's this controller settings model. Now, I know for the next iteration of this framework, on the next update, I'm going to be removing these from, well, not remove them, but I'm going to be creating the models in the core application, the core framework, because this really shouldn't really be an application model, because I don't want this error popping up each time you're building something, because this should really be part of the core. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to comment it out actually. We're going to go back, we're going to reload, see what we get, and it's asking me for another one, which is also defined within this provider file, and this is bottom one as well. So we're pointing to MagmaCore settings. Now, even though that is pointing to the core directory, that is relying upon a app model file that also does not exist. So I'm going to comment that out as well, and we're going to switch my screen again, going to reload, and now we've got no more errors. So we can go back into our home controller, and let's do a quick echo test to ensure that we're actually getting some response back. So we're going to echo welcome home, stuff like that. Switch my screen again, reload. We're getting welcome home. That's it. That's as easy as it is to set up a controller. So we've defined our index. We defined our index within the routes.yaml file, and we're within that home controller. So whatever we pass through the index that's going to be our response. That's what's going to be printed back to the browser or the client browser. So I did say as well, in our providers.yaml file, we got dependencies that we can use within our methods. So I'm going to demonstrate one of those. I'm going to call, let's just call up the request object. So I'm going to do something like, let's get rid of that. Let me switch my screen again. I'm going to call this request object from this providers.yaml file. So I'm going to say this request, right? And that's the syntax. That's how we fetch those objects from that provider.yaml file. Let's just wrap this into a var dump. Requests, and let's just dump that to the screen and see what we get. And that's it. And just like that, we've got access to any of those objects within that providers file, and we can define our own as well. We can define our own global container objects and pass them to our providers.yaml file, so we can get our controllers to access those from any controller. But the rule regarding controller components or class files is that if we're going to be passing those to our dependency container, you have to ensure that they're designed to be dependency loaded. if you get what I'm saying. So not just any class you're gonna be to pass in. You have to design your class to be able to do stuff like that. So let's go back to here. Let's close this down for a bit. We can do our next one. We could do event dispatch, which is another global object that we can use. Event dispatch, dispatcher, something like that. And there we go. We got the entire event dispatching object. Now that is essentially a basic controller. They're going to be much more to the controller bit as we sort of like get more advanced, but this is the minimum requirement that is required to set up any controller. You must extend that base controller class. We must declare a public constructor, and we must pass the route params argument to the parent construct, and we also must define our route methods as protected methods with a action suffix at the end. And the method naming is also important. It starts Studley cap, where we start with a lowercase and then every other word is capitalized, right? It must be defined as that if you want to follow the natural convention of how this framework works. Now, we've just went through the controller. In the next video, we're going to step it up a little bit. We're going to be introducing our first model, and we're also going to be building out our login controller or registration on our profile controller. It's probably going to be a little bit of a longer video, but hopefully you get the basic premise of how we define our controller and the required arguments or the required stuff that we have to pass in. So stay tuned, because the next video is coming up pretty shortly.